needs to be ownership and accountability, especially when it's in the AI. Cannot be so major.
It's good
You do that. How do you find one out of
What, trust me, once you've done it, you spend more than you always do.
Oh, really? How do you get that morning of
Well, that's the thing.
that's a miss it.
That's the thing. So, but they,
My God, my sky. I don't know.
if you're obviously blue sky, if it's cloudy, that's the hardest one. Very reliant upon your practicing your piece. So it's basically you frame it. So they're in players in the bottom third of frame, literally just on their back screen, you start going up. You don't change the size of the frame. Then you keep once you've got the ball, then you go in. Because they never cut to you until you're in midair. And it's if you're against a cloudy sky, if you lose that ball in the first frame, you're very top. So you've got to
just need to have it.
Yeah, it's better to start wider. Like I say, I normally have it so that the players in the bottom third, and then we're okay. So there we go. Sorry, this one keeps fiddling with the mic. Can somebody not tell her to stop fiddling with those mics?
I'm only here for certain people, so that's why my whole family say.
Sorry, excuse me.
Good morning, Ministers, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, decision makers. If we could have you seated now for the next session. We're going to run on quite a tight schedule, so we do need to get started. No.
how we are planning prioritization. But we are facing with challenges which we cannot predict. First of all, it was attacks on civilian infrastructure. Last year, we faced with blackouts, real blackouts during winter period. And it was like, again, everybody expecting something that it will happen, but like you cannot believe that Russians, they can do this, but they are doing this. And then it was Kakhovka dispersion, and you see that like the next challenge will be to provide water supply for 1 million people in Dnipro region, and this, like at this moment, probably one of the key problems. We are not talking about agricultural sector, which in Kherson region and in southern part of Ukraine will historically use water from Kakhovka water reserves. And trade blockade, each time we are inventing something, like again, thanks again to our partners, Black Sea Grain
Also, our budget in a quite stable situation. We managed to meet our plans. We also managed to meet our pre-war revenues target. If we are talking about reconstruction, we should ask ourselves and discuss how come we can manage to bring people of Ukraine back. And when we are discussing different projects, different incentives, this should be on our minds. It's a first message. How come we can bring our people back? Because creating favorable conditions in Ukraine help us to survive, help us to bring our future rather sooner than later. Another question we should ask ourselves when we are thinking about different project restoration, repairment, and other kind of reconstruction, how come we can manage to increase and to Ukraine's economic growth? It's a very important question. We want to restore our jobs. We want to restore our business to operate in Ukraine. We want to attract investment. We want to attract investment not only for surveillance, but also for a future. And the last question we should ask ourselves, is this all of projects, all of investment can help us to create better security in place? If it's all of this question, if you have answer yes, you can start investing in Ukraine, because it's something we really needed. To be a little bit sobering, like a Minister of Finance, traditionally we are very sobering persons. Nobody likes us, but anyway, we should think about a little bit about existing situation and infrastructure. We did, together with Deputy Prime Minister Kubrakov, very crucial stuff, trying to match our priorities with possible donors' money with our priorities, because it's something very unusual in previous lives, because we traditionally were very welcoming for any money we received. Now we are not. If we want to rebuild Ukraine, we want to stick to the priorities which Ukraine needed first, and then to think about opportunities of other countries. We want to have Ukraine, made in Ukraine in place first. Please understand me correctly. We want to have made in Ukraine first, and then to think about expectations of other nations. Because it's our country, we want to have all necessary stuff in place. We want to track all donors' money. We want to channel this money into the direction Ukraine first needed. And this it's not a very easy exercise, and I believe we can together do it in a better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, we've seen today is about mobilizing resources, and our next speaker is extremely experienced in this. Anna Bayadi, Executive Vice President of the World Bank. The World Bank's been working with partners and has assessed Ukraine's recovery needs over the coming years. What are the most striking things for you?
Well, thank you so very much. And let me just start by saying how pleased I am to be here at this important event. Let me thank the government of Ukraine and also thank the government of the United Kingdom for convening us. And thank you for your question, which I have reflected upon. What are some of the most striking things that we have seen and learned in assessing Ukraine's needs and early recovery? Well, striking is, of course, first and foremost, that we have a brutal war in Europe caused by invasion by one country into another in 2022, and it seems really, to me, still unbelievable to comprehend that. Secondly, striking is that we have a humanitarian suffering that is enormous. Just to put it in perspective, the World Bank estimates that Ukraine's poverty has gone from about 5% before the war to about 25% now. The other striking fact is, and it was mentioned, that the reconstruction needs of Ukraine after 1 year of war, and of course now we are 1.5 years into war, was estimated by us, the European Commission, UN, and government of Ukraine at $411 billion. That is 2 times GDP of Ukraine in 2021. That's striking. And the final issue, of course, is that the impacts of Russia's war in Ukraine are felt in Ukraine, but also globally in the form of inflation, tighter financial conditions, and great uncertainty. But what is also striking is Ukraine's resilience, and we hear about it. And of course, what we see it, government and services are ongoing, infrastructure services are restored, budget is well managed and executed, reforms are even being designed and implemented, and the most recent remit law is something the World Bank really supports. And I wanted to just illustrate a few findings from 2 surveys that we have undertaken recently that also shows the resilience. The first one is a monthly Listening to Ukraine survey that looks at the monitoring of delivery of essential social services that are delivered with the support of our peace project in Ukraine. And this is results from April and May. Over 90% of public service workers have experienced no disruption in receiving payment on time, others only with a slight delay. 97% of pensions have been paid without disruption. 92% of school-aged children are enrolled. 2 out of 5 receive fully remote learning, of course much higher in areas where there are hostilities. And most people report that the community health clinics are open even in regions under hostilities. There are also some areas that give us a glimpse into what we need to pay attention to. Around a quarter of those employed before the war are reported to have lost jobs. Many report that they have irregular jobs or are working to lower salaries. And 6 out of 10 surveyed report that their household is receiving a pension. This means that there are a lot of elderly in Ukraine. And we can also expect learning losses because in the areas that are suffering from the hostilities, there are a lot of children online. We also did a survey of firms that looked at 2,000 domestic firms and 80 multinational firms. And again, of course, firms have suffered revenue loss and employment reduction, but 4 out of 5 firms, 80%, have continued to stay open. Only 4% have permanently closed. And this is because firms have adapted product mix, market, ICT, location. The other very encouraging fact is that international companies have remained committed to working in Ukraine. Ukraine and the World Bank have a very long-standing partnership. We adjusted very quickly to support the war context. At this point in time, we have mobilized $30 billion for Ukraine. A lot of this is coming through partners through the World Bank, and about 23 of this has been dispersed. We provide support to all essential social services through the budget and are now also working on critical projects in areas such as health, transport, energy, agriculture, and housing. And what I'd like to maybe just finish with is, what do we see as most essential now? Well, we really need to focus on tangible results. We heard it this morning, and I'm really impressed. The 2023 budget is in much better shape, actually, than the 2022 budget was. This is very good news, and it's really thanks to the good execution of the Ministry of Finance and, of course, international development partners. But we also really need to focus now on the investment projects. They also need funding, they need execution, and they need support. We also need to make sure we stay coordinated among us and, of course, also Ukraine within Ukraine. And we need to make sure we think creatively with the private sector. I was encouraged to hear about war insurance. We need to think about leveraging, and we need to think about guarantees. And we need to stay united as a community for Ukraine and with Ukraine. And for this, I really welcome this conference. And I will finally say that we must always remember that our steadfast support to Ukraine is vital for Ukraine, but it's also an investment in global prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It is extraordinary to hear of progress even within those conditions. And we turn now to Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the Foreign Minister of Denmark. And if I could ask you, how do you think we engage the private sector and secure a long-term whole-of-society engagement in the support of Ukraine?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. First of all, I would also like to echo a warm thank you to UK for hosting this year's Ukraine Recovery Conference. And I also want to emphasize our strong commitment and support to Ukraine, which cannot lose momentum. And that's perhaps a bridge builder to answering your question, because engaging the private sector and civil society is also about ensuring long-term commitment to Ukraine. Because our strongest stronghold, our democracy, is potentially also our weakness. I mean, it's very clear that the strategy in Kremlin these days is to wait and see whether Western, the allies, the friends to Ukraine, will lose our patience. So we need domestically strong support. And by engaging civil society and private sector, we can do more in Ukraine, and we can engage more voters, honestly speaking, which will ensure long-term commitment. So a few reflections about our concrete experiences. First, about how to make an inclusive process in line with what I just said. In Denmark, we have created a Ukraine fund with strong political support in the parliament. Everybody is on board. This year alone, it is around 2 billion euro. Most of it, of course, military support, because that is the most important thing right now. But we can't wait for the last bullet to be fired before we start reconstruction. So we have allocated around 100 million euros to reconstruction efforts. And we have established a sounding board or advisory board or whatever you would like to call it to ensure a whole of society effort. And we have brought a variety of actors to the table to discuss the Danish support to Ukraine. So that's one important thing. And secondly, you could ask how to ensure the essential engagement of the private sector, both short-term and long-term. And we have found, and this is not rocket science, but we have found that companies face two significant challenges in their efforts to engage in Ukraine. And first, of course, a major risk of losses in connection with exports to and investments in Ukraine. And secondly, and I think equally important, a lack of information about projects, market opportunities, and relevant Ukrainian partners. It's not easy, I mean, to do business with Ukraine these days. And to help to overcome these challenges, we have launched a loan and guarantee scheme in Denmark's Export and Investment Fund. And with this fund, we have engaged right now more than 150 Danish companies and private funds in concrete projects in Ukraine. It is, of course, still early days, but so far, newly funded private sector projects are supporting more than 1,000 jobs in Ukraine. Short-term credits, loans, and guarantees are important tools to sustain economic activities here and now. And of course, this is just, the very first small steps towards more transformative efforts. We will need massive investments from international financial institutions and support for the Ukrainian banking and insurance sectors. But we are on our way. And then finally, I would say just a few words about the regional approach, which I also think is important to keep the private sector and the civil society on board, because we responded positively and accepted the invitation from President Zelensky last year to take a special responsibility for reconstruction Mykolaiv. And it have led to a situation where it's much more visible. I mean, with that approach, it comes with many advantages. It contributes to a broad public ownership, and it allows for direct coordination with national and local authorities in Ukraine. We have had the mayor in Mykolaiv in Denmark on several occasions already. We have had business communities in Mykolaiv. We are planning to establish a representation, a kind of satellite from our embassy in Kiev in Mykolaiv. So this regional approach is also, I think, an important stepping stone to actually do something. So, I mean, that could be perhaps 3 takeaways from the Danish experience. And then finally, on a personal note, I mean, I must say, and we discussed it here in the panel, I am so impressed about the Ukrainian leadership. I mean, I have been minister for like 15 years altogether, prime minister, finance minister. It's a tough job. But bearing in mind that you are fighting a war and you are making, you know, progress and reforms, and we are pushing for transparency and anti-corruption and sound fiscal policy, and then this huge challenge linked to reconstruction. It is amazing. And I just want to say that on a personal note.
Thank you. Amazing is the right word, and it's a potent point that democracy is proving its worth just now. So we take our place in that, and also the sort of innovative approaches that we can take, and that Denmark is already doing. So we turn now to Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. And the question for you is really, how can Ukraine evolve its economic structure to attract investment and pave the way for immediate and sustained growth, drawing on relevant lessons from earlier EU enlargement support?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for having us here in London. It's a privilege and a great opportunity, and I would like to thank the Ukrainian colleagues. And I would like to underline what Lars Løkke Rasmussen has just said. It's amazing what these people in Ukraine are presently doing, their perseverance, their resolve, but this is also true for the leaders. And without them, it wouldn't work. So congratulations on this. What is key, and this is obvious, it is not only weapons which will decide whether this war will be won or not. It will also be the economic resilience, which is presently shown in a remarkable way, all the way from tax collection to continuous production under difficult circumstances. So what we do today to support investment will make Ukraine stronger within the EU tomorrow, and I underline within the EU, because I see this guy over there as my future governor. As the finance minister of Ukraine, he would be the governor of the European Investment Bank nowadays. What we do now will lower the bill tomorrow. The more we wait, the higher the bill for reconstruction will be one day. So that we better get started now and not wait until the ink under a peace treaty is dry. That might take some time. So let's not underestimate the Ukrainians like Vladimir Vladimirovich did, because he thought he could do it easily. That is obviously not the case, and he has made the other miscalculation that he thought the West would fall apart immediately once he has crossed the border. Our institution, the European Investment Bank, stopped our business in Ukraine, in Russia in 2014, because we said he will not stop on Crimea. This will go on, and this is why we were pretty well prepared to do our job there. When we look back over the last decades, no process in Europe has been as powerful as the accession of the countries of the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact to the European Union. When I visited as European Affairs Minister in the 90s, the Baltic states, for instance, I would have never dreamed or dreamt that one day they will be so successful within the European Union, and they are, and Ukraine will as well, because some people must get rid of the idea that there is some retarded developing country joining the European Union with huge problems bringing it with themselves. No, this is going to be a strong economy, not just agriculture, but also when it comes to technology. Look at what the Ukrainian people in Western Europe are presently experiencing when they see how far behind the schedule we in Western Europe are when it comes to digitalization and the use of the electronic means, for instance. So let's welcome the Ukraine as a strengthening of the European Union once they're in. I'm convinced the Ukrainian economy can evolve massively by considering reconstruction, accession, and integration together, applying EU standards in everything they're doing, which is the case, but also bearing in mind that this course requires a lot of buy-in. I'm sure that the government can again surprise us very much on align and accelerate on aligning with the EU on rule of law. What we have heard about dream before is a dream. And we already see the fruits of this, and this is extremely encouraging because this is a reassuring message. This is a confidence-building measure for investment in Ukraine. So through lending and technical assistance, we as EU Bank are working in close partnership with all partners, but of course, particularly with the European Commission. There is, by the way, no room for competition among multilateral development banks. There is so much room for synergies and cooperation. We need to do this together. Today we signed an MOU with the Ministry of Restoration to strengthen our cooperation on reconstruction and recovery. We have a huge pipeline of projects. If we get the guarantees in order to bring this into place, we can do much, much more. And last but not least, we will later sign an important agreement with the European Commission to launch the EU for Business Guarantee Facility to improve access to finance for SMEs in Ukraine and other countries of the European Union's Eastern Partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that reminder that economic resilience as well as weapons, how much that matters, and also the excellent example of the Baltic states in EU accession and how we can look forward beyond that. So we've been talking about the recovery of Ukraine being sort of visibly about infrastructure. Troy Rudd is the CEO of AECOM, best acronym of the day, which is a major global infrastructure consulting firm. And I wonder if you could tell us how you are engaging the private sector to help address Ukraine's immediate recovery needs. And from your experience, how can we make support to Ukraine's early recovery even more targeted and impactful for the long term?
Great. Thank you very much. And first, before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, the government of the UK and the government of the Ukraine, for bringing us together and having this discussion. And as already said, thank you to the leadership of the Ukrainian government for being, frankly, so brave and leading in such an extraordinary, difficult time. As an organization, private organization, we did not start with any presence in the Ukraine prior to the invasion. But we immediately supported the Ukraine by first, and I'll say immediately within days, closing down our business in Russia and exiting the country. And since then, we have many people in Europe that have been individually supporting the Ukraine and the people from the Ukraine, and we as an organization have taken a strong position to continue to do that. Now, with respect to your question about the acceleration of the investment in the recovery or in infrastructure, I really think there's two things from our experience that I would point out. First of all, there's been a discussion about the magnitude of the recovery, and it's always talked about in terms of dollars. But you have to think about the mobilization that's got to take place, the mobilization of people to come from other countries when the recovery gets into full force, and the impact on supply chains, what actually has to be mobilized to make this happen beyond the dollars. There's no question there's the commitment, the financial commitment, and the commitment and the will to do this. But if you think about how do you mobilize in the face of so much that has to happen in such a short period of time, and think about all of the stakeholders that are involved, the stakeholders, the people of Ukraine, the decision makers within the government, the decision makers with other governments that are participating or within banks. The amount of stakeholder engagement is extraordinary. And so I think that what we've learned from our past experience is bringing a programmatic approach to this, where you have the opportunity to lay out the objectives of the stakeholders, baseline what you need to accomplish, and set out clear milestones that obviously adapt over time, but then it gives you the ability to create transparency and accountability against achieving those goals. So that's the first, and I think the most important thing is taking a programmatic approach. And I can say that on behalf of our organization, we think we will help bring that to the table, a programmatic approach, again, to the reconstruction of the country. The second important point is, again, in terms of the mobilization, it's imperative that we have governments and private sector come together, but governments to create a safe and efficient environment so that private sector can move people and goods into the country. And what I mean by that is creating government-to-government relationships that allow for that to happen. So effectively, things like extending the licenses of engineers from other countries into the Ukraine without having to be relicensed. Extending the opportunity for people to come in and out and across the border, right? Migrating to projects and to programs. and also creating an opportunity so that goods to support the construction or reconstruction can come across the border. And again, this isn't just a central government to government relationship. It's a relationship that governs all forms of government, whether it's local or municipal. So that again, those goods can come into the projects when they need to be efficiently and quickly so that we can expedite the reconstruction of the country. And again, I can't tell you how important, and there are great examples that have been done in the past, those country-to-country agreements that really open up the opportunity for really the efficient delivery of the recovery. Thank you.
Very much indeed for that. And it's very good to consider not just what needs to be done, but how. And we're going to turn now to Achim Steiner, who's Administrator, United Nations Development Programme. You've just returned from Ukraine, so you've met people directly affected by the war as well as key officials, including the Prime Minister. So how can the international community best support the government to ensure an early recovery, and how is the United Nations family having an impact on the ground?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you also to our co-hosts. Thank you for bringing us together. And indeed, talking about recovery can take many forms. You just alluded to another one. I think we heard a lot about systems and ecosystems that you are building. Deputy Prime Minister, I think the first challenge that you have faced in thinking about recovery in the midst of a crisis is that precisely you have to take a systemic approach, which is not easy given the daily survival challenges that are faced. But let me just say, having spent some days in traveling across Ukraine last week, I met your senior officials, I met mayors, I met the men and women who basically had to flee at a few hours' notice and are now trying to go back to the places they call home, but what they find is shattered homes. I met the brave men and women who are now on the front lines of what has become one of the largest minefields in the world, Ukraine, with unexploded ordnance and having to try and clear, for example, a residential area outside Kiev, Irpin, which I spent a morning at, first of all, of the mines that prevent you from going back, then the rubble that has to be removed, getting both the local administration, the equipment, the expertise to do all of this, and the financing. Recovery, colleagues, I think really is not an abstract concept right now. There were some when we met in Lugano who said, how can you talk about recovery and reconstruction when you're in the middle of a war? If you speak to those tenants that I met, if you meet the small and medium-scale entrepreneurs, the men and women who are actually the backbone of Ukraine's economy right now, and you speak to them and you hear how they lost everything, became internally displaced people, live in another part of the country right now, have to rebuild their businesses, how little money can actually make an absolute difference in starting again. It is these hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small enterprises that you and your Prime Minister, when I met him, also highlighted as a top priority. Recovery, reconstruction is not only physical, it's the social infrastructure. We already heard this morning about hospitals, about schools. It's also about the many injured that are now in hospitals that have to recover. I spent time in a hospital complex in Lviv and learned about the challenge of just producing enough prosthetics, finding people who can produce them, setting up businesses that can actually provide an input at that moment. But let me briefly say, sir, as you also said, I'm here on behalf of the Secretary General this morning representing him. He could not be here, but he wanted to send a very strong and unequivocal message of commitment on behalf of the United Nations. I'm joined by the resident coordinator of the United Nations country team here, many of our agencies who are working in Ukraine right now, and some of us for decades. UNDP has been a partner in Ukraine for over 20 years. Others were mobilized, for example, through the humanitarian response immediately after those attacks began. Just this year, 5.4 million people have already been supported by the humanitarian response that the United Nations, its NGO partners, are rolling out. Our challenge, however, remains that saving lives is something you have to do as part of also thinking about recovery, but the humanitarian appeal right now is only 25% funded. We do emergency responses, for example, to the Kakhovka Dam. The difficulty of trying to bring immediate support in such a catastrophic event was a challenge, but humanitarian agencies, local NGOs, local authorities joined forces. Many people were struggling to survive the immediate disaster. The question now is, can we quickly help the government also to rebuild and help the people to recover? And thirdly, the UN development system with 24 agencies and over 3,000 staff invested in virtually all oblasts that are currently not occupied by Russia, helping local authorities to plan, to do assessments. Anna spoke about the damage assessments that we do together with the World Bank, the European Union to support the government, the human impact assessment that was just published last week to also draw attention to what is happening to people's livelihoods, the loss of income, the food insecurity that is being faced, the challenge for government to mount the kind of social safety nets. This is the United Nations commitment to working with our colleagues in Ukraine and as a partner with many of those who have you just heard speaking, and on whom we also rely to bring the resources that allow us to be truly a voice for recovery while lives are being saved, livelihoods are being created. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Such an important discussion. We're also, as I said, on a tight time scale, and I know that Mr. Rasmussen, you will have to leave. There's going to be a great rush from the stage at 1, but if you need to leave between speakers, do. And in the meantime, we're going to turn next for a valuable perspective on the Baltic states and the EU response to maintaining economic stability in the region, to Valdis Dombrovskis, who is the Executive Vice President for an Economy, Commissioner for Trade at the European Commission. And I wonder if I can ask you that the Ukraine and the EU have been clear on its future as a member state. What is the EU's view of the private sector's role in recovery, and how will the reform linked to membership status galvanize this?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to speak at the Ukraine Recovery Conference on the future of Ukraine, as it has been stated also by President von der Leyen earlier today. The future of Ukraine is in European Union. And just yesterday, European Commission put forward a Ukraine facility worth 50 billion euros to cover the time period from 2024 to 2027. And this facility has 3 main pillars. One is, of course, public financing, which we are going to provide for Ukraine, both to maintain macrofinancial stability, but also for Ukraine's recovery needs. And there we, of course, hope that this EU's initiative, coming with a sizable medium-term package, will also help other donors to mobilize their support. But another important aspect of this package is how to mobilize private sector to support Ukraine's recovery. And that's actually one of the topics of today's conference, including the question of war insurance, because clearly in current circumstances for businesses to go to Ukraine, to invest, to do different kind of economic activities. The question is about covering the country risk and covering the war insurance, and that's why it's so important that EBRD is now coming with this initiative on pilot scheme concerning war insurance. We are going to sign the agreement to work on this pilot scheme later today to cover the estimated finance needs. So European Union is going to be one of the supporters of this initiative. It's also important for companies to get involved to have export credit guarantee schemes, and we are currently working on the pilot project of export credits to Ukraine. And I also would like to mention several European Investment Bank initiatives, EU for Ukraine initiative to support infrastructure reconstruction, address priority investment needs, also ensure business support. So we'll be supporting, European Commission will be supporting this package financially with 100 million euros guarantee. And today we'll be also signing 2 other agreements on support for SMEs in Ukraine. So clearly this support for business will be important part of Ukraine reconstruction effort. And finally, the third aspect of our Ukraine facility is that we link together investments and reforms which are linked with Ukraine's path towards EU accession. So the idea of the plan is that Ukraine would prepare a medium-term reconstruction plan in cooperation with the EU, in cooperation with other donors, and this plan would bring together necessary investments and reforms, not only to help with reconstruction, but indeed also help with green and digital transformations of the economy, and to help with reforms necessary for Ukraine towards joining the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for that. And we've seen today international institutions stepping up. We're next going to hear from the OECD and Matthias Cormann on if you could tell us a little bit about what the OECD has been focusing on to support the Ukrainian recovery and reform effort.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along today and for hosting this important event. Since we last met, we've continued to work with the government of Ukraine, with our members and the European Union, international partners providing support to Ukraine. And we have also welcomed Ukraine as a prospective member of the OECD. We've started an initial accession dialogue with Ukraine. Earlier this year, we opened an OECD office in Kiev, which is designed to further strengthen our cooperation on the ground and further strengthen our impact on the ground. But the most important recent development has been the decision to enter into an agreement with Ukraine on the establishment of a formal 4-year OECD country program for Ukraine. That program is designed to provide a structured approach to our reform and institutional support to Ukraine across the public policy spectrum, with the objective to achieve increased adherence by Ukraine to OECD standards and best practices, and also to boost its participation in OECD policy bodies. It's a program which reflects Ukraine's reform priorities, and it's designed in particular to support efforts to attract quality private sector investment in support of the recovery, and generally to help optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery. Just very quickly, in terms of areas of focus, first on helping to ensure transparent, fair and effective regulatory, administrative and legal processes, which is all about helping to provide certainty and boost confidence as part of boosting private sector investment. We're working with the State Regulatory Service of Ukraine to improve regulatory policy making and further simplify administrative processes. We're promoting sound governance of state-owned enterprises. We're supporting the effectiveness of Ukraine's tax policy administration. We've also provided support and training for tax officials, judges and law enforcement staff at the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which brings me to the second point, which is that we're working to make further progress with anti-corruption and integrity measures. Our country program involves analysis and capacity building to support Ukraine's adherence to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, to which Ukraine has recently become a participant. Currently, we're conducting a review of Ukraine's anti-corruption action plan based on international standards and best practice benchmarks, including with respect to corruption prevention and criminal responsibility. We're focused on improving competition and encouraging investment in the energy sector. It's been noted that Ukraine has and continues to do an amazing job in maintaining and restoring electricity supplies disrupted by Russia's atrocious war of aggression. But of course, next Friday we will launch the OECD market study of the electricity sector in Ukraine, which provides practical recommendations on longer-term reforms for the period after the war, again to improve regulatory stability, enhance the functioning of wholesale and retail electricity markets, and also to accelerate the integration into EU electricity markets. Fourth, we're focusing on supporting efficient, well-connected and sustainable infrastructure with a sound policy framework for Ukraine to leverage public-private partnerships and concessions for infrastructure, and ultimately again to boost investment. Fifth, we're focusing on supporting growth and recovery of Ukraine's small and medium-sized businesses with a specific policy review focused on Ukraine's SME sector based on the European Union's Small Business Act across dimensions such as access to finance and procurement opportunities, and also developing advice on supporting the adoption of digital tools by SMEs. There's much more that I could talk about, but in the interest of time, let me just say in closing that, of course, as we work to do our bit, focus on our areas of comparative opportunity to make the best possible contribution, we will, of course, continue to coordinate closely and work closely with all international partners, bilaterally and also through the multi-agency donor coordination platform. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's a great accent to hear in the coalition of the committed. I'm afraid we're going to have to lose, I think, 2 ministers now, Minister Smoshenko and Minister Kubrakov, to other meetings. But we still have some key speakers left. So we're going to move on to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Norway, Anniken Huitfeldt. And the question for you would be that this year, £6 billion Ukraine support programme announced by Norway shows the long-term commitment made by your country to Ukraine. Are you able to say something about the focus on early recovery?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Some weeks ago, I participated in a recovery conference in Odessa, together with my colleagues, my Nordic Baltic colleagues, and also Kuleba, and all those local politicians elected by their own people in free elections in Ukraine really inspired us all, I think, to look ahead, to build a stronger and more resilient Ukrainian democracy and a stronger Ukrainian economy. But we know very well that money and goodwill is not enough. So I really appreciate this invitation to this important discussion, because reconstruction efforts must be coordinated, and they must be based on also local needs. There are numerous examples on humanitarian efforts not based on local demands, but rather on the individual donors' country and what they are willing to provide from their own storages, and how the recipients are forced to buy goods from the donors. That tells more about the donor than the willingness to assist. The result is often that the local markets are totally destroyed, that local economy and local businesses suffer. So we are acutely aware of this when we are implementing our largest assistance program ever. And through the Norwegian assistance program, we focus on firstly, early recovery, rebuilding infrastructure, such as electricity system and bridges. Secondly, making sure that Ukrainian services, such as schools and hospitals, can remain open. Thirdly, finding ways to strengthen Ukrainian businesses, innovation and entrepreneurship. Fourthly, strengthening the Ukrainian democracy and legal system. And finally, of course, military support. In many ways, Ukraine is very different from other humanitarian efforts. But we must make sure that we don't repeat mistakes from the past. When providing assistance to Ukraine, we must make sure that local businesses will benefit. Therefore, we announce today a donation of 25 million euro to provide war insurances and guarantee mechanisms so companies are willing to invest. This is a part of the 7 billion euro Norwegian program you referred to earlier in your question, Sarah. Because we know what businesses are asking for: a reliable legal system, commitment to anti-corruption, and burden sharing when it comes to investment risks. And Ukraine has already accomplished a lot. The willingness to fight corruption and the decentralization reforms, I think, are positive steps. And I will also thank the EBRD and the World Bank, Anna, for the very good cooperation and also the coordination with the EU civilian mechanisms. And I'm very pleased to see so many Norwegian companies here today, because I think that private companies really demonstrate that we are in there, all of us, for the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for underlining it's both the ambition and the values in your commitment. So our final panelist is a former officer in the US Navy Civil Engineer Corps, so understands both logistics and urgency. He's Bob Progeda, and he's here as CEO of Jacobs, which serves critical markets, as we know, in global infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and national security. So if I may ask you the question of how will the private, public, and non-profit sector rebuild a resilient Ukraine that prospers even in an ever-changing and unpredictable world, and what conditions are necessary for this recovery?
Sarah, thank you for having me. I think it's being last. It's either no one is listening or everybody is listening because they want to go. But it's great to be here, and also very inspiring. You said I was a former naval officer. I have witnessed firsthand reconstruction of war-torn areas where the resilience of an international community coming together as one. What I saw this morning and what we've seen all along is very, very inspiring. So thank you. You know, when Minister Kuprikov put the first slide up and it talked about just the magnitude, and we've heard a lot of numbers this morning about the magnitude from a monetary standpoint, from just a sheer volume perspective. You know, as the leader of Jacobs and PA Consulting, 70,000 people globally, 20,000 people here in Europe. With deep expertise in infrastructure and clean energy and everything that the country needs. I thought to myself, important, but that's not why we're all here. That's only one step, because it's not about us, it's about the people of the Ukraine. And so when we really think about what outcome are we trying to drive in the reconstruction of the Ukraine, what we believe it is the self-actualization of the Ukrainian people to be a part of the international community. And so, you know, if you start with that outcome, then all of the interfaces and the interdependence of what we do becomes even that much more important. And what we were kind of reflecting on as a team when we were thinking about what we would say today is there was an American psychologist back in the 50s named Abraham Maslow. And Maslow came up with a profile. It's called the hierarchy of needs, and how each of these needs for people build upon each other. And at the bottom of that pyramid is the physiological needs: energy, water, food. You can start to see the parallels here. The next is security. Do I live in a secure environment? And then with the physiological needs and the secure needs, things like love and esteem and respect start to come, and if you compare it to what we're talking about at a global scale. And then at the top of that pyramid is self-actualization. And so the interface between the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofits, I really believe it's the interdependency and not getting too caught up in what we're the experts at, but really understanding what are we trying to achieve. And I believe the environment that needs to be in place, clearly peace, needs to be in place, but as the minister talked about, we're already doing so much now, even with the challenges that the Ukrainian people are having. But I think all of us need to think about a recovery-based ecosystem for sustainable growth and prosperity for the country of Ukraine. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. The ecosystem of recovery, we'll leave it there, but thank you so much for this terrific panel. And I think we finished on time so people can have lunch. And thank you especially to Ministers Marchenko and Minister Kuberkov. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
We're just gonna. I'm at lunch, so we'll change to that.